I'm with Deputy Green, the Minister for Housing, and we're discussing the new plan which has come out, the white paper which has just come out from Housing. It's been kicking around for a while. Your predecessor had a draft form of this which he discussed at scrutiny. Is it much different from Deputy Power's proposal?
No, the principles are the same. All I've done is to put some meat on the bones about how we would do it, but generally the principles are, because I was part of Deputy Power's consultation team, in as much as he had a very small working party, I was on that. So I've just added to it, and we can go through what those actually mean in really 5 areas. The 5 areas being the proposal to have a strategic housing unit, and that's around policy. We'll talk about that in detail in a minute if you wish. The appointment of a regulator to ensure that the social housing is properly regulated and that the policies set by the strategic housing unit are actually carried through. The third one is not in any particular order, but forming the housing department into a housing association, and that's around flexibility, around being able, here we are sitting on £1 billion worth of assets with not a penny working really for us. Well, we have a need for more homes, and we could get that working for us. And the Gateway, which we've already got, but the Gateway is already proving that allocation of social housing, albeit not sufficient, is much fairer than it was before. And of course the way we're going to pay for it is partly around the increase in rents or the reduction in subsidy. I prefer to call it, some people will call that spin, but the reduction in subsidy for those that are earning at a level that they could afford not to be subsidised. So those on income support, for example, will be completely protected. Now, I know some people say that's about moving money around, but guarantee people on income support completely protected. I have concerns about those that are just above that line. They're the ones that could perhaps find it difficult, and that's why we're prepared to means test and put in a transitional arrangement with them that could, if the circumstances needed, take 10 years for them to move to the right level of rent. So it's those 5 areas. Of course, you will have questions you might want to ask about those in particular, and I'm happy to take
Well, in the magnitude of what the proposal, the reform that's being suggested here, suggests that there's something pretty radically wrong with the housing stock in Jersey. I mean, we've had a housing law since 1949, and which the primary purpose was to prevent further aggravation of the housing shortage. And reading these documents and everything else that goes with it, and the discussions you've been saying about the poor quality of a lot of the housing stock, that certainly hasn't been achieved, has it?
No, it hasn't been achieved, and to be fair, it's not the fault of the staff and the officers in the department. It's because we failed to resource them adequately to do the job, and that's why these proposals are radical. I think they're honest. They identify all the problems and give some solutions, and I think some people will approve of them, some people will not, but I hope to convince the middle ground that if we're going to house our community and stand any chance of doing it fairly, then we will have to do something along these lines. And the longer we talk about it, the worse it gets.
Well, 1949 is a long time ago. I mean, there has to be, I know it's to be said, you don't want to blame people, but somebody has to be blamed for this, don't they? I mean, 1949, and then we've got a bigger problem now than we had in 1949, numerically speaking.
Mike, you're more of an expert on that sort of thing than I am. I wasn't even born then. But I'm looking forward, not looking back. Yes, we have had problems. We've got houses that haven't been properly maintained. Not as many as some people would have you believe, but nevertheless, we've got houses that have not been properly maintained. We've not fulfilled our part of the contract with our tenant.
One of the words that's constantly used is, expressions, social housing. What is social housing?
Social housing for me is subsidised housing that goes to people that need it. Now, they may need it for different reasons. Clearly, for many of them, it's around the affordability of rents, but there may be a combination of factors around affordability, around overcrowding and affordability. In other words, to move up to the next stage, they might be able to afford a 2-bedroom but not be able to afford, without help, a 3-bedroom, for example.
But the word subsidy implies all sorts of things, because if you're subsidising somebody to live in a private accommodation, is that by definition social housing?
I think that's actually no, in a word. But I think what the attempt to do that with the private rent rebate scheme was to take some of the pressure off the social housing. I don't believe it's entirely worked. We haven't got sufficient social housing. So it helps, but it doesn't solve the problem, and it isn't truly social housing.
Because the social housing in the context of that accommodation owned by the states is only a small part of the overall housing stock of the island.
It's, I don't know what percentage it is, I'm sure you would, but I don't, but it's 3,500 units of accommodation we're talking about that the states have, and then there's just over another 1,000 or so that belong to housing trusts, and you know, population of heading towards 100,000 it's not rocket science.
I want to dwell a little bit on this word social, because it is so used, and I think it is misused. And people, for example, would that housing held by the trust, is that social housing?
Absolutely, and for that reason they will also come under my proposals to regulate.
Right.
Trusts are social housing, yes.
One of the trends in your document, which incidentally is on sale at £3 and it should be free at the States Gref, it's one of the trends is towards user pays. I mean, it's expressed in different ways, but raising rents and all these, forming a housing association so that you can develop housing, and also the trend is about user pays, and it's a trend which is running throughout our government. Health, looking at people caring for themselves in the community. Planning to be self-sufficient, pay for itself, those who make planning applications for it. It's running throughout our society. Obviously we know there's a push on stave 10% and all the rest of it. How much of this plan, can you honestly say, is genuinely about housing people, or how much of it is about saving money?
It's all about housing people, because the saving of money has been done. That's why we're in the housing conditions that we are in. This is not about user pays. This is about using our £1 billion worth of assets that we're sitting on without a penny in loans, being used, those assets being used as collateral to develop more housing. That's the first thing. Second thing is, it is about targeting our subsidy, because social housing is subsidised. It is below market rates, and we've done a lot of work on that. It's about targeting our subsidy where it's truly needed. Now you could have, and I think this would be quite typical, a family that comes into social housing that really needs that support, that help, that subsidised rent, and then things improve. They get better jobs, children leave home, and they find themselves in a better position, but we continue the subsidy. That can't be right. But for those people, of course, at the moment, and this is where the Strategic Housing Unit, when it does its job, will help. So we're talking longer term.
Yeah, but you have to view that in the context of you have policies against, or with Social Security, about paying the housing component of income support,
yes,
for people under 25. This ridiculous, which I know you disagree with.
I totally disagree.
But you're not going to change it because the demand is too great.
Why would I change it and create a waiting list that I can't meet?
Well, it's fairness, isn't it? If you're wanting to solve one problem, you have to address the whole problem.
We will address the whole problem, but what I'm saying is you can't address the whole problem in one go.
But these unfairnesses have to be addressed.
They will be addressed eventually.
We do have anti-discrimination legislation supposedly coming in this year, when these sorts of questions will be more and more looked at. Yeah, why should a 25-year-old not be allowed to rent, or a 23-year-old, or an 18-year-old, or a 16-year-old? Why shouldn't they be allowed to rent?
Well, you know I happen to agree with you. But at the moment, I'm not going to change that policy. I'm not going to change that policy because where you've got scarce resources, you have to target them where they're going to have the best effect. But I do agree with you, and that Strategic Housing Unit will carry out that part of that work. The Strategic Housing Unit sounds a very grand title. We're talking about one expert in housing, one expert in housing, looking at that housing provision across all the tenures about affordable. And we could have a huge debate, and probably use up all your film on what's affordable.
Well, indeed, if people are encouraged to leave state-provided housing, state-owned housing, they're going to finish up in the private sector. Are you suggesting that they're not going to be entitled to any subsidy to live in the private sector?
No, I wasn't suggesting that. What I was suggesting that if they find their circumstances improve, that wouldn't it be nice to offer them an alternative, i.e. some sort of shared equity or some purchase scheme where at their time of life they can't get a normal mortgage because they haven't got time to repay it over 30 years.
It might sound nice, but as you know, there is not an up and running legal home buyer scheme at the moment.
Exactly.
It doesn't exist.
Another thing that needs to be sorted out. Another role for the strategic housing unit.
Why can't you just hand over the whole thing to housing trusts and let them get on with it, if you want to provide what you call social housing?
I think that the states have an obligation to provide housing, not just give it all away. I personally have the view that I want to maintain control of the £1 billion worth of assets that the public own, not just give that away, and control that and make sure it's properly targeted, properly used, and that we make the assets work.
But this is what worries me. This is becoming more of a developer. It's just the government being a developer. There, in fact, is no obligation on the Jersey government to house anybody, is there? There's no obligation. Like in the UK, somebody's got a dire housing situation, there's an obligation under the Housing Act to house them. There's no such obligation in Jersey.
I think it's a moral obligation. I'm not sure what the legal obligations are, and maybe that's work that again needs to be done by the Strategic Housing Unit, because we will bring forward eventually laws which the regulator will make sure are enforced. I've got a lot of work to do. I think you'd agree. I've been Housing Minister now for something like 14 months, and I've worked incredibly hard with my officers to move this forward. I don't have the answers to every problem.
No.
I have the answer to some of them, but I'm keen to solve those problems.
Of course, the Housing Law 1949 will stay in force. Do you think it's done any good since 1949?
I don't know, is the truthful answer. But again, when I've got my expert on housing, the strategic unit, these are the very things we need to be looking at. We need a proper housing strategy for Jersey.
Well, of course, there's a strategic plan for housing under the Island Plan. But of course, as I have said, strange enough, your predecessor, Deputy Power, has argued that that plan ought to be abolished. The housing component of that should be abolished and redrawn because it was not adequate.
I think that's the only area that I disagreed with Deputy Power on, not because of what he said, but if you abandon that completely, we'll be in a void for years and nothing will get done. I actually think we need to get on with developing. I've just managed to persuade the Treasury Minister without too much effort, I have to say. I was pushing at an open door to lend me £27 million to get on with some of the development. If you'd taken all that out of the Island Plan, we wouldn't be able to do much of that. Okay, I've been able to do the renovation work, for example, that's planned for La Collette tower blocks. But I wouldn't be able to get on with the building of Lascende, for example. But because we have that plan in place, I can now get on with that. Is it adequate? No, it's not. Is it better than nothing? Yes, it is.